Alex sat alone in his cramped apartment, the hum of the refrigerator his only company as the evening air grew colder. He hadn't turned on the TV all day, avoiding the news that had already flooded every corner of the city. Instead, he tinkered with an old motorcycle, the smell of oil and grease filling the room as he adjusted the carburetor with the practiced precision of someone who had spent too many nights under the hood of a car. The world outside felt far away, its problems distant and irrelevant to him. But that night, something was different. There was a heaviness in the air, a palpable sense of unease that made Alex pause every time he moved. It started with a faint flicker of the overhead light, followed by the sirens that wailed through the city. He dismissed it at first. Another false alarm, another burst of panic over some news headline that meant little in his own life. Then the screams began. They weren't the screams of a simple accident or fight. They were raw, frantic, filled with terror. Alex set down his tools and walked to the window, peering out through the grime-streaked glass. The streets below were empty, save for a few stray figures walking erratically in the middle of the road. At first, he thought they were just drunk or lost. But the way they moved, it wasn't right. There was something unnatural about the way they stumbled, dragging their feet as if every step took enormous effort. Alex's pulse quickened. He turned away from the window, muttering under his breath. "It's nothing," he told himself. "Just a few crazies." But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew better. This wasn't normal. A loud crash echoed from below. Alex jolted and glanced back out the window. One of the figures, no, it wasn't a person anymore, had lunged at a man walking down the street. The attack was vicious, violent, a blur of movement as the figure grabbed the man by the throat. His blood sprayed across the sidewalk, dark against the pale light of the street lamps. The man fought back, but it was hopeless. The figure tore into his flesh with a primal ferocity, ripping through him like an animal. Alex's heart thudded in his chest as he backed away from the window. The screams continued, louder now, echoing through the quiet night. Something had gone terribly wrong. He turned quickly, grabbing a small flashlight from the table. Without thinking, he pulled on his jacket and stepped out of the apartment. Outside, the air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and blood. The sirens continued to wail, but the city felt eerily quiet, as if everyone had either fled or fallen silent in fear. Alex's feet moved instinctively, carrying him toward the center of town where he hoped he might find some answers. The streets were chaos. People ran in every direction, shouting in panic as groups of figures, too many to count, stumbled through the streets, attacking anything in their path. The mob of attackers wasn't human anymore, not in any way Alex could recognize. Their skin was pale, their eyes wide with madness, their mouths stained red with the remnants of their victims. Alex ducked into a narrow alley, pressing his back against the cold brick wall. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of riot? A mass psychotic break? Or something far worse? He knew it didn't matter. Whatever it was spreading fast, and it was taking over the city with terrifying speed. In the distance, the sound of a car crash rattled the ground, followed by the unmistakable noise of screams and shouts for help. Alex didn't wait to see more. He turned, racing through the alley, ignoring the burning ache in his legs as he headed for his apartment. There, he could at least regroup, figure out his next move. But as he rounded the corner, he froze. A figure stood blocking his path. It was a man, at least it had been. Now, his face was twisted into a grotesque mask of hunger and rage, his clothes torn and bloodstained. The figure's eyes met Alex's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The man's lips pulled back into a twisted smile, revealing jagged teeth. Then, with a screech, the man lunged. Alex didn't hesitate. He ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding the man's outstretched hands. The figure crashed into the wall, and Alex wasted no time, grabbing a nearby piece of metal pipe and swinging it with all his might. The blow connected with the figure's skull, sending it sprawling to the ground with a sickening thud. But the figure didn't stay down. It groaned, struggled to its feet, and charged again, faster this time. Alex backed away, his pulse racing as he searched for something, anything, to defend himself with. His eyes fell on the small fire extinguisher he had left by his apartment door. He grabbed it and, without thinking, blasted the figure in the face. The spray hit its eyes, and the man stumbled back, howling in pain. Alex didn't wait to see if the figure would recover. He sprinted toward the nearest exit, heart hammering in his chest, lungs burning with each step. As he burst out into the street, he glanced over his shoulder. The figure wasn't following him anymore, but the streets were filled with them. They weren't just attacking, they were hunting. The world had changed in an instant. Alex could hear the distant wails of sirens, the cries of people in the streets, but none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was survival. He turned, running faster than ever before, knowing that there was no going back. Alex's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as he sprinted through the alleyways, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. The night had swallowed the city whole. What was once familiar now seemed like a maze of danger, every corner concealing the unknown. His legs burned, his chest ached, but he couldn't stop, not yet. Behind him, the screeching growls of the infected echoed, a constant reminder of the relentless horde closing in. The figures were everywhere, stumbling over cars, dragging themselves through the streets in their single-minded pursuit of flesh. Alex had barely managed to escape the initial attack, but now the city was a death trap, and survival was no longer about finding shelter. It was about staying ahead of the chaos. He turned another corner, his eyes scanning the street ahead. The flickering neon lights cast an eerie glow, throwing long shadows across the abandoned buildings. The streets were eerily silent, except for the occasional crash or distant scream. The normal sounds of the city, traffic, chatter, the hum of late-night bars, were gone. In their place, an oppressive silence that felt thick and suffocating. Alex slowed to a jog as he reached a narrow bridge that spanned a small canal. It was higher up than most of the city's streets, offering a good vantage point. He paused to catch his breath, glancing behind him. There were no immediate signs of the infected, but he knew they weren't far off. His eyes moved over the rooftops, empty, dark. There was nowhere left to hide for long. The world had descended into anarchy, and Alex was just one man in the midst of it. His initial panic had given way to cold, hard determination. The infected weren't human anymore. They were predators, mindless and vicious, driven by a single, insatiable need. Alex wasn't sure how it had happened, what had triggered this outbreak. But he was certain of one thing. If he didn't find a way out, he would be next. A distant roar broke through his thoughts, followed by the thumping of footsteps. He didn't need to look. He knew what it was. He turned sharply, heading down an alleyway that led to a row of abandoned warehouses. There was a chance, a slim one, that he could find something useful, a weapon, supplies, anything that might give him an edge. His footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor as he pressed forward, his senses on high alert. He reached the warehouse and yanked at the door, relieved to find it unlocked. Inside, the air smelled stale and musty, but there was no time to waste. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing crates, broken furniture, and discarded machinery. But there was no sign of life, human or infected. Alex crept through the warehouse, searching for anything useful. He stumbled across a crowbar and, without hesitation, grabbed it. Its weight felt solid in his hands, reassuring. It wasn't a gun. He'd never been able to find one of those, but it would do. As he stuffed it into his backpack, the distant sound of growls grew louder, closer. Alex froze. The horde was near. He bolted toward the back of the warehouse, pushing aside debris in his path. The back door was locked, but with one forceful strike from the crowbar, it splintered open. He emerged into a narrow alley, the cool night air biting at his skin as he looked around, searching for his next move. The streets were alive with movement. Far in the distance, He saw flashes of figures moving under the streetlights, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they followed the noise. The horde was spreading, and there was nowhere to run if they cornered him. He had to think fast. Taking a deep breath, Alex turned and sprinted toward a nearby fire escape, scaling it quickly, his muscles screaming in protest. The metal rung beneath his hands, and the creak of the ladder sent a jolt of fear through him. He had no time to second-guess himself. If the infected saw him, there would be no escape. At the top, Alex scanned the rooftops for a safe route. His eyes locked onto a distant building, a few blocks away. There was a slim chance, that it might be untouched. If he could get there, he could regroup, find more supplies, and plan his next move. He leapt from one rooftop to the next, making his way across the city's skeleton of concrete and steel. His mind raced as he plotted the best path. Every sound, the skitter of a rat, the distant roar of a horde, set his heart racing. It was only a matter of time before the city was entirely overrun. As he reached the edge of a rooftop, Alex paused. Below, the streets were teeming with infected. Their eyes gleamed with a feral hunger, their snarls filling the night air. Alex had been fortunate so far. He hadn't been seen. But the closer he got to the building, the more dangerous his chances became. He looked for an opening, an air vent, a window, anything. His eyes landed on a second-story window, barely ajar. It was risky, but it was his only option. Alex moved swiftly, dropping down from the edge of the building, landing silently on the fire escape of the next structure. He moved with precision, using the shadows to conceal his movements as he approached the window. With a quiet grunt, he pulled the window open. Inside was dark, the only light coming from a dim street lamp that filtered through the curtains. He slipped inside and quickly closed the window behind him, trying to steady his breath. For the first time in hours, Alex allowed himself a moment to think. The building was abandoned, empty of both life and the infected. The quiet was almost unbearable after the chaos outside. He dropped his pack to the floor, leaning against the wall as his body screamed in protest. He was still alive, but for how long? Alex glanced around the room. It was an office, littered with old paperwork and broken furniture. He moved through it slowly, scanning for supplies. There had to be something. Food, water, maybe even a map. Something that could give him a sense of direction in a world that no longer made sense. The noise outside was still there, distant and haunting. Alex knew the horde was out there, hunting. It would be only a matter of time before they found him. And when they did, there would be nowhere left to run. Alex paced back and forth in the dimly lit office, his mind racing as he weighed his options. The building was quiet now, the only sound the occasional creak of wood or the whistling wind outside. But it wouldn't last. The infected were closing in, their growls growing louder as they scattered through the streets, searching for anything alive to devour. The silence was only temporary, a false sense of safety before the storm. He needed to leave. He knew that much. But the world outside was a death trap, and no matter where he went, the infected would follow. He had already narrowly escaped once, and there was no guarantee he would make it again. The window in front of him offered little comfort, its view obscured by rusted iron bars. He had no idea where to go next. He couldn't stay here, but every road out seemed to lead to more danger. He glanced at his bag, packed with the few supplies he had scavenged over the past few hours. Water, some snacks, and the crowbar. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Alex's mind wandered back to his apartment, the scene replaying in his head. The moment when the infected first appeared felt like a dream, too surreal to be real. But the destruction, the chaos, the hunger in their eyes, it was all too real. The world had changed in the blink of an eye. The rules were different now, and Alex was forced to adapt or die. A thud echoed from the stairwell below. His heart lurched in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. The infected had found their way into the building. Alex's instincts kicked in. He grabbed the crowbar and moved toward the back door, his steps silent on the wooden floor. He couldn't stay here, but he also couldn't just run aimlessly into the night. His eyes flicked back to the window again, his only escape route. A crash came from the floor above. Then another. The infected were getting closer. Alex moved quickly, his pulse racing, but his mind sharp. He wouldn't die here, not like this. There had to be a way out. He reached the window, pried it open, and carefully climbed out onto the fire escape. The cold air hit him like a slap to the face, but there was no time to hesitate. The sounds of the infected grew louder as they moved through the building below him. He had to move fast. Climbing up to the next level, Alex stopped. Below, he could see the horde gathering in the street, their movements erratic and desperate. Some of them were still drawn to the noise of the city, but others seemed to be instinctively looking for food, their eyes glazed and hungry. They were getting smarter, more organized. The infected weren't just mindless creatures. They had a purpose, and it terrified Alex to think that they might be evolving. His hand gripped the metal railing as he caught his breath. He had no choice now but to make a stand. The building was surrounded. The horde was everywhere. There was no easy way out, and there was no way to outpace them. But Alex was done running. He dropped down onto the next level of the fire escape, landing silently but ungracefully. The metal groaned under his weight, but it didn't matter. His eyes scanned the alley, searching for anything useful. A garbage bin sat nearby, its lid half open. He reached inside and pulled out a broken bottle. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it would have to do. With the bottle in hand, Alex made his way to the street, moving in and out of the shadows. He kept low to the ground, his senses heightened as he stalked his prey. The infected were everywhere, shambling aimlessly in search of their next meal. He could feel the weight of his decision settling in. There was no turning back now. One of the infected wandered too close, its rotting face twisted into an expression of hunger. It didn't see him until it was too late. Alex leapt forward, swinging the bottle with all his strength. It shattered against the creature's skull, sending a spray of blood across the pavement. The infected dropped to the ground with a wet thud. But more were coming. Alex didn't have time to celebrate. He needed to keep moving. He glanced around, looking for his next target, but the street was a maze of twisted shapes and rotting figures. It was a killing ground, a place where only the strong could survive. And Alex was determined to be one of them. He moved silently from one infected to the next, using the environment to his advantage. The broken glass from the shattered bottle gave him a new weapon, sharp, jagged, and deadly. He stabbed one creature in the neck, then another in the chest. The cold precision of each strike a reflection of the desperation that now fueled him. But the horde kept coming, and no matter how many he took down, more filled the gaps. The city was alive with their presence, a nightmare come to life. Alex's strength began to wane. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was starting to ebb, and he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The world around him blurred as he pressed on, his body screaming for rest, but his will to survive driving him forward. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A massive group of infected, their bodies packed together like a tidal wave of flesh, surging down the street toward him. It was impossible to outrun them, impossible to fight them all. Alex's chest tightened. His escape route had vanished. There was no way out now. For a split second, Alex considered surrender. He could give up, let them overtake him, and end it all. It would be easier. But then he remembered his hands, the crowbar, the bottle, the jagged glass. He remembered that there was still a way to fight, to push back against the darkness. Alex made his choice. He wasn't going to die quietly. He wasn't going to be just another victim of this plague. With a final, desperate cry, he charged forward, pushing through the crowd of infected, swinging the glass and the crowbar with everything he had left. His body burned with exhaustion, but his mind was clear. There was no fear anymore, only the brutal instinct to survive. And in that moment, as he fought against the tide of the undead, Alex realized that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the will to live could still burn brighter than anything else.